You're listening to the Joel Martin Mastery Podcast, your source of music news, stories, and 2-hour deep dive interviews with bands that have sold over 80 million albums. If you've been enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to subscribe, like, comment, and share. Now let's dive into today's episode. Welcome to the Joel Martin Mastery Podcast. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. We are joined by a very special guest. He's achieved a level of mastery as the bass player, backing vocalist, and songwriter for the multi-platinum selling and multi-Juno award-winning band Moist. So welcome to the podcast, making his triumphant return, Jeff Pearce. Jeff, how are you? And can you believe that it's already been around 2.5 years since the first interview?
I can't believe it, Joel. Seems like it was last year at the most. Yeah, this sort of the way that time works these days.
Yeah, and time kind of expanded and contracted during the pandemic. You know, there's a lockdown that felt like it was 4 months and it was a week, and
Yeah,
time got all shifty for a bit
I
there.
had a bit of a remembrance of all that when I was talking with one of our, not to give away what the records are yet that I've chosen, but one of them I feel like I've only had it in my collection for like 3 years, but I remembered then that it was it came into my life well before, well, not well before, but just before the pandemic started, which means it's now it's been with me for 6 years or so. So, but yeah.
I wanted to start by thanking you because you were one of my first well-known guests on the podcast. You know, I had started the podcast 4.5 years ago. For the first 2 years, nobody cared, nobody watched, nobody listened. And then about 2.5 years ago, I started to get some well-known guests. So, you know, Chuck Daly, the Salads and I Mother Earth, who you're familiar with, Rick Jacket from Finger 11. And then there was a string where there was you from Moist, there was Blue Rodeo, there was Colorado, there was, there was these. It's weird. There was this period around where you came in that just the floodgates opened. So I want to thank you for saying yes to this unknown podcaster, this young buck that was just getting started.
Well, you're welcome. It's because you do good work. So you do good work, and the news goes around that this is a fun interview and a fun hang, and yeah, no, I mean, I think I heard about it from Chuck. Yeah, Chuck told me that he had done it and that it was a really good time, and that yeah, that made me jump in and listen to the podcast, and I saw what a great job you do and what a great concept it is for a podcast as well, doing the 2 hour "This Is Your Life" kind of kind of podcast.
Yeah, the VH1 behind the scenes.
Yeah,
That shows the power of a good reference.
yeah, oh yeah, for sure. Well, this is all about. I mean, our industry is all about word of mouth and always has been, and not word of mouth necessarily just in terms of how good you are, but also just in terms of how well liked you are and how well you get along with others and that kind of thing. So yeah, anyway, it's great to be back. Thanks for I got to admit that I knew you were doing these 5 favorite album things, and as soon as I found out about that, I started thinking, oh, I hope I get asked. I hope I get asked. And
There,
so it was great to.
you put it out into the
I
ether,
did.
you manifested it, and you probably needed however long you've been thinking about it. You probably needed that long to narrow down your 20 favorite albums to five.
Yeah, the 5 have probably changed 50 times in that time. So I have I can't wait to get to my honorable mentions list. It's full of albums that could have easily made this list, but it was useful when I asked for clarification from you and you said that it could be your favorite album today, even your 45 favorites today. That sort of took the pressure off a little bit.
Yeah, every guest I've had in this series, the My Five Favorite Album series, they always start with a disclaimer saying, okay, listeners, just so you know, I have lots of favorite albums. I had to choose just five. They almost feel disrespectful to their other favorite
Well,
albums.
that's the problem. Yeah. I'm afraid that Fisherman's Blues by the Waterboys is going to be out there feeling really jealous that I didn't pick it. And honestly, if it was another day of the week, I could have. So yeah.
I feel like the Waterboys came up in the Blue Rodeo interview that I did.
Oh, really?
Glenn, the drummer, he talked about the Waterboys at some point during that interview, I believe.
Oh, I'm gonna have to listen to that to see which album he picked because they made 3 of my favorite albums of all time. So Yeah.
Oh man, that's awesome. So we mentioned before that back on episode 60, you came on the podcast. This was back in June of 2022. We did a full 2 hour deep dive. We covered your life, your career, your discography. So our listeners, after this interview, go back, check that out. And then with this, we're going to do my 5 favorite albums. And you're going to share your favorite albums of all time, or at least your 5 choices for today. And then at the end, you can just rapid fire through your honorable mentions so they don't feel left out.
Excellent. Perfect. That's great. I can't wait for that opportunity.
Awesome. So, before we jump into those 5 favorite albums, I just want to take a few minutes to catch up because it has been 2.5 years. You had just released Moist's fifth album, End of the Ocean, a few months before that interview. So now there's been 2.5 years since that release. While you're recording, you're so close to it. I feel like after 2.5 years, maybe you have a different take on it. Like it's had room to breathe. Your tentacles aren't so caught in it. And I guess, do you have like a retrospective take on that album? Because I remember it was fresh for me, and I was saying how much I love the album. I thought it was in your top 2 or 3 albums that the band had ever released. I had it in my end of the year episode for the best albums of 2022. I had it there.
I remember that. Yeah.
I remember saying Life of the Party. Is that the name of the song? Party's over.
Party's
Party's over.
over.
Yeah.
Party's over. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
remember saying "Party's Over" is my jam on that album. That's my favorite song. So do you have any thoughts thinking back on that album now that it's been out for a bit?
Well, a funny thing about that album is that with okay, like with Silver, for example, I remember listening to Silver when it was first done, like when we first got a mastered copy of it, and immediately going, "Oh, I wish this was better." And
Oh
then,
no.
oh yeah, for sure. And that was kind of, that was just one of those things where you just finish something and you have no perspective on it whatsoever. And the record, it ended up doing okay.
That's your
So
best-selling album, isn't it?
yeah,
Four
so
times platinum.
yeah, so four hundred
You're a harsh
thousand.
critic.
Yeah, but it took me uh like I really enjoy the record now. It took me almost 30 years to really enjoy listening to Silver without hearing the flaws and that kind of thing. Creature, kind of the same thing, but it took me a little less time. I was probably enjoying listening to Creature after it was out for about 10 years or so. Mercedes, I kind of always enjoyed just because it's so weird and varied. But I find that with the End of the Ocean, it still comes up on my I have like the final masters just sitting on my list of songs that I cycle through. I've got, a list of 20,000 songs of my favorite that I just have on random repeat all the time. And whenever one of those songs come up, I am always happy to hear it. So it's been no time, but I've got way fewer regrets about this record than any of the other albums we've made. So I think we must have done a pretty good job. I'm still very fond of it, and I can still put it on for fun, even though it still feels new, but I'm still really proud of what it is and what it sounds like. And yeah, I think we did a really good job. I'm still trying to sell this record one copy at a time. So whenever I run into somebody who learns that I'm in Moist and they're like, "Oh man, I loved you guys back in the day," I'm like, "Oh, hang on, do you realize that we have a new album out?" And I point them towards the Apple Music or Spotify or wherever their thing is. And yeah, it's a one person at a time kind of process getting this to the ears of people.
Well, I think we can send more than one person over. So, our listeners, go check out that album, End of the Ocean by Moist, came out in January of 2022. And do you think your faster acceptance of this album is to do with the fact that with the earlier albums, you're a young musician, there's engineers, producers, record labels, and it's like there's the time constraints and the money restraints with, recording studio time. Do you think that because you work so closely as a band making this album, that it's
Yeah.
like you were there making the decisions as it went to get to the final
Yeah.
product you're so happy with?
No, you're absolutely right. And the other thing about it is that we like we made Creature in the space of basically a couple of weekends, essentially. Sorry, not Creature. Silver was the space of a couple of weekends. Creature was like 8 days of tracking drums at Warren Heights, followed by probably 2 weeks of doing overdubs at a smaller studio in Montreal. So it was like a under probably 25-day process. Probably the same for Mercedes as well. But with this record, because we had no, it was it was very much a pandemic project, and we were recording all of the parts independently from each other and then sending them back to Mark, who was producing the whole thing and putting it all together in his studio. So we actually took our time. It's a really good point. We took our time with it. We didn't. I feel like we did, and also we didn't have a deadline for when it was going to be released. We didn't even have to show it to anybody until we had the thing ready. So yeah, that's actually very very true. I hadn't thought about that at all.
I was actually shocked at how great the album sounded. Not that I don't think you guys are gonna, come up with this amazing sounding album, but the fact that you recorded it yourselves, it was during the pandemic, so everyone kind of had to record their own instrument and then send it over to Mark, who assembles it. And just with all those factors, you would think it would be more of an indie sounding album. It wouldn't
Yeah,
have the big studio quality. It sounds incredible. Like there's such a warmth to it.
yeah, for
Wearing
sure.
headphones, it's a pleasant listen. A lot of times when, it's a rock band or something with an edge, a little heavier, it can be a little piercing, a little harsh sounding. That album has this thickness to it, this warmth to it. There's something about it that's inviting. I was shocked at how great it sounded for all the elements involved.
I think we got really lucky because we recorded we went and recorded the drums before COVID started at a really great studio in Toronto called Revolution Sound, which has a beautiful live room, and so we that's the one place where we weren't hobbled at all was in recording drums. And so much of the sound of a record comes from that initial drum sound and the sound of the because that's when you determine whether or not the record is going to have space. Like basically, the space of the album comes from the recording of the drums, and because you really feel what room the band is sitting in and playing in when you get that happening. And so we were very fortunate that we got the drums wrapped up before, like right up, like literally. I went home from that session thinking that the world was ending the next day. We cut everything actually shorted by a day because everything was like, okay. Everyone's got to go home now. The world is closing, and so we had that to begin with. We had just really great drum performances by Francis, recorded it in a really great studio with a great engineer, and so Mark was able to use that as the sonic blueprint, and everything else that went in on top of it had to fit with that vibe. I think we knew that was the vibe we were going for, and I think that helped Mark a lot when he was making his choices about the performances and about the sounds of the instruments that we used.
Yeah, good point about needing a good sounding room for the drums is almost everything besides the drums you're recording them, they're close mic. So the vocals are right up to the mic. So you're hearing 99.9% the direct voice and not the room.
Absolutely.
The electric guitar, you have a mic right up to the amp. You're hearing mostly just the guitar amp.
Yeah.
But the drums, you have the overheads, they're picking up the entire room. And that's why, people that have home studios, they mostly have to go into the big, great sounding rooms for the drums, and then they build an album on top of that.
Yeah, you can almost always tell an indie album just by the sound of the drums. Even if they're using drum samples, these cymbals don't have the same. They sound like they're from a different spot. They don't sound like they're in the same room with the drum kit because that's the way that sampling tends to work. So yeah.
And what has the reception been like for the album over the last 2.5 years? What have you been hearing from fans? Do they compare it to past albums? Do they say, "Oh, it's so unique"? It's a current sounding album. What are you hearing from the fans?
It's been the feedback has been incredible for it. Like everybody who has heard it likes it a lot, and they tend to compare it to Creature more than any of the other Moist albums, which makes sense because Creature also was recorded a with big drums in a big space kind of thing and was built up the same way. Um, so yeah, the feedback from everybody has been really good. I still have uh, I don't hear from fans very much because they're people aren't our music, our fans are busy raising children and taking care of elderly parents and that kind of thing. They're not dialed into music the way that we all were when we were 16 years old or whatever. But certainly from those that I run into, and even family and friends who are, have been, who checked it out, are very complimentary of it, and they seem to think it kind of represents a good um, kind of an amalgamation of all the various stages of Moist at the various times, and kind of culminates 25 years of experience into 10 songs.
So after the release of the album and then after the interview that we did together, you guys then went out and did a tour across Canada, from BC. I believe you made it all the way to Quebec. What were those shows like? Man, I keep thinking of the pandemic where just everything was locked down. Musicians didn't know if they would ever be able to play live again. So what was it like to actually get out there and play
It
some
was,
shows?
yeah, it was amazing. It was I mean, from the actual experience on stage was so incredible. It felt like such a release. And I think that for the first time ever, even more so than when we regrouped after a 13-year hiatus, I feel like we on stage were feeling that, like, that, wow, I didn't like that feeling of, we didn't know if we would ever do this again. And I don't think there was a single moment on stage that we took for granted. We were loving every moment of it, and I feel like the same thing was happening in the audience as well. Because for a lot of the people who were coming to see the show, it was the first time they'd gone out to see a show since the pandemic had started. So we certainly felt a lot of that back from the crowd as well. The touring itself, the travel was a bit of a nightmare, because everything had just, after everything being ground to a halt, the whenever it was 2.5 years ago, the there was, things hadn't quite gotten back up to speed in terms of air travel and that kind of thing. You may recall there was lots of stories about horrendous backups at Pearson, and issues with planes not having pilots and that kind of thing. And we encountered all of that. We
Uh,
had to
You just,
we
it just reminded me, didn't you guys have a show that you couldn't get to? Was it
Yeah,
Vancouver or somewhere?
Vancouver, we couldn't get to it. So because we were trying to fly out a day before as well. Like, it wasn't like we were uh you know casually trying to fly in a few hours before a show. We were leaving the day before, and we sat around the airport, and they couldn't find a pilot for the airport. They were telling us all these things that just weren't true. The plane's not there yet. The plane's not ready. We could see the plane, but apparently they didn't have anyone to fly it. And so that was an extremely frustrating evening. And then the next day, when we were waiting to fly out, because we had missed Vancouver, we managed to make it to the next show of the tour, which was Edmonton. But yeah, so I think that I feel now like things have gotten slightly more back to normal, which is great. So we're looking forward to doing more shows again in the semi near future, and having things be slightly better off than that.
There were so many factors back then that made it difficult to tour. So the whole world was locked down, and then when it opens up, you have every band on the planet that hasn't been making money is now touring again. So
Yeah.
you have just this surplus of people trying to tour. So it's impossible to book any venues. All the tour vans are taken, all the tech guys, you need a stage tech, you need a guitar tech. They're either all taken or a bunch of them retired and became real
Yeah,
estate agents during the
absolutely.
pandemic.
Yeah.
The prices of everything went through the roof.
Yeah, it
I
was crazy.
apparently a van rental was like $10,000 to
Yeah.
get a few cities over.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it was crazy, and it was understandable. I mean, it was definitely a seller's market at that point because of the pent up demand, but it definitely made touring much more frustrating than, and everything would be okay if it worked, but it just there was just too many times when it didn't work. But anyway, I'm not going to complain about it, because we when we're actually on stage and we were playing the songs, we were in just such an incredible happy place. So it was the stuff around that was challenging.
The actual shows made it all worth it.
They
And
did. Yeah.
What's funny is looking back since the last interview, I realized that I had your bandmate Kevin, keyboard player for Moist. I had him on episode 96, and we were saying before we started recording that it feels like it's maybe been a year or so since you and I did the interview, and then I look back and my interview with Kevin has already been way over a year. So
It's
t
crazy.
time's been flying, and then. Guitar player in Moist, Jonathan, what's funny is after we did our interview 2.5 years ago, he saw that interview. And I think I had posted that I was driving home from Quebec, just on the other side of Ottawa, but on the Quebec side from my sisters. And he goes, Joel, you know that I live right there. Like you drove right by me. And like I had never met him before. I was just aware of him as a member of Moist. And I didn't know that I guess at some point during the pandemic he had moved over close enough to me. And I found out that he was a hockey player, but he hadn't played since moving over to this area. So it'd been a few years since he'd played. So I'm a goalie, so I get called almost every day of the week to play. It's like a bass player. Every band needs a
Right.
bass player.
Yeah.
Every hockey team needs a goalie. So I just talk to different teams that I'm on, and right away, a few days later, got Jonathan out, and they loved him because he's such a nice guy, and he's actually a good setup man. He's selfless. He lets everyone else get all the goals, and they picked him up, and I was playing with him once a week on one of my teams,
Oh,
and
perfect.
I'll be playing with him on this Thursday coming up. So I've had
Oh,
this
that's great.
funny moist connection since the last interview.
Excellent. That's great. Awesome. Yeah.
Just getting to know everyone. So we have one fan question, and then we'll dive into your five favorite albums. So this is from Elizabeth Moon, who's a well-known Moist super fan. She says, "I would like to know why Jeff chose to leave the band after the reunion tour, and what made him decide to return. I love that he returned, and please let him know I miss seeing them live so much." So that's from Elizabeth. So
Oh, that's so nice.
yeah, you
Excellent.
had
Okay.
mentioned in the first interview reasons for leaving and coming back, but we have some brand new listeners
Yeah.
checking this out today.
No, for sure. No, it's very, very simple. When we regrouped in 2013, I had a 3-year-old at the time, and the band was very serious. And I loved getting back and doing the reunion tour, but the band was very serious about really making a go of it with new music and new recording and maybe getting a new record deal and all that kind of stuff. And I just knew from what it was like when I was 26 years old and didn't have a family, how much of a commitment that would be. And at that point, the other guys in the band who have kids, their kids were like in high school and like at the point where they're no longer needed. And I just simply didn't want to. I didn't want to miss anything. I didn't want to miss any part of of seeing my kid go through those years. So that was just the priority that I took. And I went back into the band when, as kids they do, they get older and they start needing you less. And I also kind of wanted to show Charlie, who's my son, uh, kind of what his dad had done in a way. And it was the best thing was when I came back into the band. The first show that we did was playing with live at the Festival d'été in Quebec, the FEQ, I believe they call it, and in front of 15,000 fans. So that was his first sort of, he'd heard about it, he'd heard something about it, but that was the first chance he had actually had to see it in action. So now I'm back in the band because now I want to show Charlie that it's following your dreams is as important as anything in this life.
He thought you were just some schmuck at home, but he didn't know dad was a rock star.
Exactly. He had no clue.
We
Yeah.
had to show him what's up.
Yeah.
That's too
Yeah.
funny.
He still finds it kind of it's still a little bit abstract for him. So
And you're looking back on that time where you made sure you were around to be there with him and raise him. You're happy with that choice,
oh
obviously,
my
the
God,
time you got
absolutely
to
for sure.
spend.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I had a 9 to 5 job at the time as well. And so being able to be home on weekends and evenings and sometimes my 9 to 5 job would mean that I could take it wasn't actually 9 to 5. So I was spending days with him and I kind of worked an opposite shift as my wife, where she would work later in the day and I would start working later in the morning so I could take him to school every single day. So I walked him to school every single day from the time that he was in junior kindergarten until he no longer needed someone to walk him to school in, like, whatever that was, beginning of grade 6, I guess. So yeah, and I wouldn't trade any of that for anything.
I think you made the right choice there.
Yeah.
Uh, let's dive into your five favorite albums. You're the first guest in this series that actually has a theme for the five albums. So can you share the theme that we're going with? And then if you can just list the five albums so our
Yes.
listeners know what we're going to sink our teeth into coming up.
Okay. So I did the theme because I needed some boundaries, because picking five favorite albums is just too difficult a thing to do when you've been listening to music as an avid fan for over 40 years, kind of thing. So I decided that the boundaries I was going to give myself is that I would pick my favorite album from each of the decades that kind of matter the most to me. So an album from the 70s, an album from the 80s, an album from the 90s, one from the aughts, and one from the tens. And I could have gone back and done the 60s. That album is probably Abbey Road. Um, but I thought I would, if we're doing the top six albums, then, and I couldn't have done one from the 2020s because I've I don't know anything that's been released in the last 4 years, with the exception of "End of the Ocean" by Moist. So that album was out in the 2020s, apparently 2022, and it's a fantastic album. So I recommend checking that out as well. Um, but yeah, so the albums that I picked were from the 1970s. I picked "Houses of the Holy" by Led Zeppelin. From the 1980s, I picked "War" by U2. From the 90s, I picked an album called "Whale Music" by the Rheostatics. From the aughts, I picked um, "In Rainbows" by Radiohead. And from the 2010s, I picked the Hamilton soundtrack, uh, the soundtrack to the Broadway musical.
It's funny that you mentioned, if you started with the 60s, you would have chose the Beatles. Um, it's funny because I had David Bottrell, the producer for Tool and Peter
Oh yeah,
Gabriel,
yeah,
Russian, amazing producer. And he's before he named his five, he said, Joel, you should have a rule for the series that nobody can choose the Beatles because everyone will just choose the Beatles. Like that's the
yeah,
foundation upon what everything is built. So you should just say no Beatles, and then it frees everyone up from just having five Beatles albums in their
yeah.
list.
No, he makes a good point for sure. Yeah.
And then a few guests after that chose a Beatles album just to prove
Well,
it's
I mean, you kind
so
of have to. He made Just because David Bottrell makes a good rule doesn't mean we all have to follow it. So
that's true. Yeah. So yeah, you can bring on the Beatles albums, but it's funny that you started with the 70s. So
yeah,
all right, so let's dive into from the 70s, Led Zeppelin, Houses of the Holy. This is from 1973. Do you remember the first time just hearing Led Zeppelin, period?
yeah. So the first time that it's kind of funny because actually, I mean, Led Zeppelin. So I went to high school. I My grade 9 year was 1980. So at that point, Led Zeppelin was effectively gone. I think probably John Bonham died like a few months after I'm not sure of the exact date, but I feel like it was a few months after I started high school. But that kind of music was not my jam in high school for the most part at all. So Led Zeppelin, I was familiar with. I certainly knew most of the songs on Led Zeppelin 4 for sure. Obviously, "Stairway to Heaven" was omnipresent for sure. But I think the first time I ever heard, I think I actually remember the first time I ever heard a Led Zeppelin anything was I was on a camping trip, and the kid that I was sharing the tent with had brought a guitar, and he played me the opening riff of "Stairway to Heaven." And I'd heard about "Stairway to Heaven," but I don't think I'd ever heard the song at that point. And I was just mystified. I thought it was the coolest thing. Everything about the way it sounded, the way that it was fingered, the whole thing. Um, but despite that, I still wasn't a big Zeppelin fan through university. University was way more for me about, well, we'll get into that in a bit when I talk about the 80s thing. So it was only when I hit university that I really became a big Led Zeppelin fan. And part of that was because Mark McAway, the guitar player for Moist, um, he was a huge Led Zeppelin fan, and so we shared a house for a couple of the years that I was in university, and he had all the albums, and that was when I really dove deep into those albums. And Houses of the Holy was the one that stuck with me. The which it's the one that has stuck with me the most over time, probably.
So Led Zeppelin has four or more albums that are considered in the greatest albums of all time. So there's so many you could have picked.
Yeah,
Uh, why this one specifically? You said it stuck with you more over the
yeah.
years.
There's lots of reasons for that. First is that I feel like it was their mythology making album. Um, the first two records were pretty bluesy. I mean, Zeppelin 2 has Immigrant Song on it, which is definitely not bluesy, but Zeppelin 3, sorry, Zeppelin 2 is Whole Lot of Love. Zeppelin 3 is Immigrant Song. Zeppelin 4, still very steeped in the blues. Houses of the Holy, which is their fifth album, is the first time that they completely stepped away from making a bluesy kind of record. There's nothing like When the Levee Breaks on it, or like any of the really bluesy stuff. How Many More Times and Communication Breakdown, all this sort of stuff that's really based in the blues. So I feel like it's the album that really sort of solidified the mythology of what they were in terms of the bigness of the whole thing. But I also feel like musically it was a giant step forward for them because it there's only 8 songs on it, but every one of those 8 songs is unique in some kind of way. And there's humor on the record. There's different styles. There's the kind of Jamaican feel of Dire Maker, and there's uh, Over the Hills and Far Away, which is just a really great kind of rock and acoustic kind of vibe. Uh, but the biggest part, I think, and the thing that's really stuck with me the most, and the reason why I think it's their best album, is that it's the record that really shows the emergence of John Paul Jones, not just as a bass player. The bass playing on that record is fantastic, but the piano playing on that record is incredible. Actually, not just piano, but also keys, just the keys overall, and the string arrangements and all that stuff, which totally came from him, is the reason why I think that record it just lifted their musicality to a point far beyond where they'd gotten to with the previous 4 albums.
Yeah, I heard that two of the members set up their own home recording studios in between the fourth album and this album, and it really helped them to expand their sound and experiment. So by the time they got to the studio to record the fifth album, they had tried all these different sounds and different things, and that's why it's not such a straightforward blues or rock album.
Yeah, I mean, it really isn't. It's not even a heavy album. It's heavy, but it's not like a song like No Quarter, for example, which is the probably the darkest, most kind of ominous sound song in their catalog. Like it's just so dark. But the guitar sounds in it, they're not loud, gnarly guitar sounds. They're very small but super menacing. Like it's really hard to describe how that guitar sounds without you got to listen to it. It's not it's and it, you probably even if you think about how you even if you know the song really well and you're picturing in your head, if you were actually to go back now and listen to it, you'd be like, oh yeah, that's not a super fuzzy, distorted, heavy guitar at all. It's just a really menacing sounding guitar. And every song sounds different. I mean, like, so Song Remains the Same, which kicks off the thing, is it's like an overture kind of song. It's almost like the overture from Tommy, from the Who's Tommy. It's that kind of vibe. It's a quick pace. It moves through a whole bunch of different movements into the I had a dream, oh kind of thing. And it just sort of it almost introduces that this album is going to be something unlike what you've heard before. I mean, like Zeppelin 4 it kicks off big too with the Hey Hey Mama business, but that kind of defines how that record is going to sound. And the same way that song remains the same with there's kind of shots and it's very orchestral sounding, and yeah, and then as it moves through, I can't remember the second song. Rain
The
Song.
Rain Song, yeah.
Oh my God, Rain Song. So Rain Song, like the strings on the Rain Song, and the Rain Song is a funny song because it almost sounds like I was listening to it today at work, and it almost sounds like an AM Gold kind of song in a good way. And believe me, like I love like classic AM 70s gold music, like Glenn Campbell and that kind of thing. And it's got that vibe to it. It's just lush and beautiful, and it's a long song with very little singing in it. Most of it's just about the instrumentation, and it's yeah, and the string arrangement on that is incredible. Yeah, and it goes from that into. Should we just go song by song here? Is that okay?
Yeah, we can, but the Rain song, what's funny, we're talking about the Beatles. Apparently the Rain song, it was George Harrison that joked with John Bonham saying, what did he say? He complained that Led Zeppelin never did any ballads. So I don't know if he said that before they had done Stairway to Heaven. And I guess Jimmy Page was like, oh, we'll show him. And he wrote the Rain song because of that. And apparently the first two chords are the same chords as a George Harrison song as like a jab or a, just
Oh yeah, it's something.
something. Yeah, yeah.
It's something. Oh my god, yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
So they did the
Bling.
George Harrison chords to be like, oh yeah, George, check out this ballad, and they like
Oh,
stole
that's
his
really good.
chords.
Speaking of Abbey Road, there we go. I knew that Abbey Road would come into this somehow. So
Yeah, and then
yeah,
Rick Rubin, who's one of the greatest producers of all time, he says this about the Rain song. He says, "I don't even know what kind of music this is. It defies classification. There's such tasteful, beautiful detail in the guitar and a triumphant feel when the drums come in. It's sad and moody and strong all at the same time. I could listen to this song all day. That would be a good day." So that's from
yeah.
Rick Rubin.
Okay, good job, Rick. Yeah, I mean the funny thing about the song too is that the drums don't come in until the very end, basically. Like it's like John Bonham is like basically sitting on his hands for the first 3 minutes of it. There's nothing going on in the song. And Led Zeppelin later on in their career, they made a lot of songs that are long and that okay, I'm going to say something controversial, but I also think that Houses of the Holy is the last really good Led Zeppelin album.
How
I know that
dare you, sir?
I know a lot of people, a lot of people's favorite album, including some really good friends of mine, people who probably were really good friends until I've said this, that they're cutting off the friendship now at this point. They love Physical Graffiti. Some people like In Through the Outdoor, not that many, but Presence, same thing.
I might have
But
to put a disclaimer on this part of the
yeah,
podcast.
yeah, yeah. Uh, but I feel like they're the longer songs later on. They kind of meander. Like everyone loves Kashmir, but I don't love Kashmir. I find it kind of meanders in a place that I don't like that much, or in the evening or whatever. These other super long songs that came out in the years that followed. But the Rain song, yeah, like Rick said, you never get tired of sitting in that space. It's just beautiful and yeah.
So they used the Rolling Stones mobile studio to record that album, and I guess they parked up at Mick Jagger's estate. It's called Stargroves. So Rolling Stones recording studio parked in front of Rolling Stone members' house to make the album. So I thought that was kind of cool, a connection between the British bands and
I wonder where Mick was at the time. I wonder if he was away or if he was loitering in the background someplace.
I'm not too sure. You mentioned that No Quarter might be the darkest song Led Zeppelin's ever done. For our listeners that might not be aware of the song or the lyrics or the theme, why do you say it's such a dark song?
Oh, walking hand in hand with death. It's like
Oh,
it's
that'll do
or
it.
yeah, yeah. I don't even know if that's the lyric, but that's the kind of vibe of it. So the vocal processing, it sounds like Robert is uh like in like uh very like in the throes of some kind of lamentation. It's just like the whole sort of story, like the imagery that's provided, it sounds like something really bad is going to happen. Even I mean, the vibe of the music, even just the original, like the opening riff, the opening uh, keyboard riff that comes in, which I think it's just a either a mellotron or an organ. No, no, it's electric piano. It's like a whirly or something like that. Um, it's just yeah, it's just dark and foreboding. And when it goes from the yeah, just every chord every chord that comes along in the progression just gets lower and lower. And there's not a major chord to be found in that song, to my recollection. someone out there is probably going to fact check
Yeah,
me on this,
yeah,
but
yeah. I wasn't aware, but the term no quarter is a military term, and it means when there you have the enemy captive, you give them no quarter, that
yeah,
there will be no
no
mercy.
surrender, no like, yeah,
And then it's so that's on your part as the one that captures them. And then there's a side of the person that got captured. It's them um not surrendering either. So it's like dark on both sides. Like you will get no quarter here. This is it for you. And then on the other end, not even asking for something on your behalf. You
mercy,
realize
yeah,
this is the end and I
yeah.
will accept that. So it's such a dark, like two-way
Oh
term.
yeah, totally. And I mean, again, I'm not really good for listening to lyrics. They kind of I don't know the lyrics to that many songs, strangely enough. But I know that like the Hounds of Doom are flowing still, and the devil watches my. It's just everything about it is just dark. It's just dark, but you can forgive it because it's so beautiful. Like the song is just, again, it's just beautiful. And when the guitar solo comes in, like that sort of really, yeah, there's other sort of keyboard sounds that John Paul Jones is doing that is uh, that just kind of add to that. And there's again, it's not there's not that much going on in the song. It's pretty sparse, but every element is perfectly placed and perfectly helps setting the mood. But yeah,
I
but there's lots of fun songs on this album too.
That's true. Yes, we will transition to other songs that might be
Yeah.
more fun. I found a really good description from Spin Magazine about the song Over the Hills and Far Away. I thought this was like so descriptive of Led Zeppelin and their sound. So it says about Over the Hills and Far Away, Spin Magazine says they think it's Led Zeppelin's best song, and they say it best demonstrates just about everything the band does well. The unforgettable and impossible to pin down opening riff, the life affirming transition from acoustic to electric, the constant switches in tone and dynamic, the piercing solo with double tracked climax, the impeccable interplay of guitar, bass, and drums, uh, Plant shrieking, the gorgeous coda, even the super oblique title. So it's like all of
Oh
Led Zeppelin
yeah.
wrapped in one song.
Oh yeah. I actually thought about the super oblique title, but that is totally it. It's very mystical sounding, even though the song, yeah, the song's it's a great song, and it almost it starts off sounding like a love song. Hey lady, got the love I need. Like it's perfect and jaunty and fun, and yeah, that song is it's just a good natured song, and that it's just a really great fun riff. It's one of those riffs that when you're first learning how to play guitar, you're pretty proud of yourself when you figured out the hammering for it. And yeah, and as that thing says when it gets in the anytime you love.
That note is so good.
Oh yeah, it's so good for sure. Yeah. And that song is just fun and it's light. And that actually that is one of the kind of up to that point in their career, it's one of the kind of lightest, most happiest kind of sounding songs. Like there's songs like on Zeppelin 3, there's Tangerine, which is kind of a nice kind of love song kind of thing. And but even their other acoustic kind of songs, like on the ones that are on Zeppelin 4, uh uh oh my god. Uh track 2 and track 3. Misty Mountain, no, not Misty Mountain Hop. Oh god.
That's all good. We could search them
Yeah,
up.
I'm bad with song titles sometimes. But
Just go listen to the whole album. Yeah.
they're acousticy, but they're not um they're not fun. But they're not they're again they're sort of like they they're not purely fun. They sound there's something very dark and mystical about them. Whereas Over the Hills and Far Away is just a fun kind of romp. Yeah.
Do you think Led Zeppelin is quite possibly the greatest band of all time? I mean, it's not often that every single member in a band is individually considered to be the greatest musician of all time on that instrument. That's what you have with Led Zeppelin. What
That's
do you
true.
think? Are they like if aliens are like, okay, give us one band, one rock band that represents the best that planet Earth can come up with? There's the Beatles, and I guess I'm trying to say like maybe if it's a heavier band, so you don't have to include the Beatles, but it's hard to not pick Led Zeppelin to represent planet Earth.
Yeah, no, for sure. They're definitely in the conversation as well. They had the misfortune of being cut short after 10 years. I mean, the recording career was not that much longer than the Beatles, really. Again, and they're definitely yeah, I mean the first five albums, and certainly other songs from the other. I mean, despite the fact that I'm kind of slagging the other everything that came out after this, there's songs from the three albums that followed that are also great. Like All of My Love is an amazing song, and oh, Down by the Sea, down by the down by the ocean, whatever. There's a couple songs on Physical Graffiti that are great as well. So yeah, I mean Zeppelin's definitely in the conversation. Definitely in the they're of the they would be one of the five for sure.
Yeah, I think any other band putting out Led Zeppelin's worst album would be like a career achievement, probably.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely for sure,
Yeah.
definitely.
Um, yeah, when I did a 1 minute podcast episode on Led Zeppelin, sharing the story behind the band name, like how they came up with Led Zeppelin.
Oh yeah,
And so I was researching the band. They're the seventh best-selling artist of all time. It's estimated they've sold between 200 and 300 million albums, which is just wild.
that is crazy and not surprising as well. And I mean, I can kind of imagine who the six above them would be, but yeah, and that puts them in the conversation. You can't. I wouldn't put um Elvis and Michael Jackson are probably on that list, and I wouldn't put either of them in the conversation. So, but you go with the Beatles, you could go with the Stones, Led Zeppelin, the Who, and one of the other bands that are on my list as well that are coming up shortly. So,
Yes, stick around for the next one. So some albums come out and they're critically acclaimed, but they don't sell, or they sell, but they're not critically acclaimed. In this case, the album comes out, huge commercial success. It's certified diamond in the US, which is 10 million copies sold. It sells over 12.5 million globally. It's nominated for Grammys. It goes to number one in Canada, the US, Australia. There's a fourth, the UK, I think. There's a fourth country it went to number one in. And what's strange is a lot of times albums come out, and when they sound different than the ones that came out before it, they're they get mixed reviews. They're panned critically. So in this case, Houses of the Holy comes out and it got negative reviews, probably because everyone's used to the first four albums that kind of set the template for what rock and blues should be. And then this is so different, they don't know what to do with it.
right.
And so it actually, I'm going to read a negative review because I find it funny. And then years later, when you come back to it, it's always gets rave reviews looking back when you can now accept what it was.
Right, sure. Yeah. This happens a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I got mixed reviews upon release. Rolling Stone called the album one of the dullest and most confusing albums I've ever heard, believing that the band had digressed from the epitome of everything good about rock to a watered down heavy metal act. That's Rolling Stone back in the day.
That's pretty funny. I mean, the other thing to remember though about this album is that this is pretty cutting edge for 1973, right? So people might just not have known what to make of it. Like there's an awful lot of stuff. This album precedes a lot of other music that would take inspiration from it. So yeah, it might have just been too much.
Yeah. So then when critics look back, I have four things that are positive. So classic rock named it in the 100 greatest British rock albums ever. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame had it in the definitive 200, the top 200 albums of all time. Pitchfork has it as the top 100 albums of the 70s. And then Rolling Stone has it in the 500 greatest albums of all time at number 148. So
Okay.
looking back in retrospective, it's an all-time great album.
Yeah. So do you know from that list there what what tracks would have been played on radio? Because obviously the album or AOR radio would have been the big thing that would support it. But it never occurred to me to think about.
Yeah,
Like
so
I
there's
know,
four singles. There's four singles out of the eight. So the singles are Over the Hills and Far.
right?
This is in order of when they were released. So
Yeah.
number one, Over the Hills, Far Away, Dancing Days, Dire Maker, and The Crunch were
Oh,
the
right.
four
Of course,
singles.
Dire Maker. Yeah, you still hear Dire Maker all the
For
time.
me, Dire Maker is the song I associate with that album.
Yeah. Right.
And
Yeah.
we all say Dire Maker. And have
It's
you
Drew.
heard like
Oh yeah,
the
it's Drew Maker. It's Drew
yeah,
Maker. Yeah, because it's a slang on because it's got a reggae feel, and so dear maker is like Jamaica, Jamaica, Jamaica kind
Yeah,
of thing.
so
Yeah.
Plant explained the title is derived from an old joke where two friends have the following exchange. One guy says, "My wife's gone to the West Indies," and then the other person replies, "Jamaica?" And it's supposed to sound like, did you make her? No, she wanted to go. So it's a
Yeah,
weird British joke that nobody got, and
you
people
gotta you
people
gotta have the right.
say it's Dire Maker,
Yeah,
and apparently in the UK they don't say Dire Maker, they say it like Jamaica or whatever.
right. You gotta have that
I'd
accent to
never
make
heard
the.
that before, Jamaica. It's
Yeah,
Dire Maker here. So
it. I didn't know, but I mean that is information that came to me certainly later than when I thought it was Dire Maker for years. So yeah.
that's too funny. So let's dive into your next album. This is from the 80s, and it's the album War from U2. This comes out in 1983. Why does this album mean so much to you? This is early on in U2's career.
So I want to actually preface this by saying this is probably my favorite album of all time, or certainly the album
Ooh.
that means the most to me. And it is early in U2's career. And if you look at the stats on War and you think about the songs on it, particularly Sunday Bloody Sunday and New Year's Day, you think about them as being staples of classic rock radio. But that wasn't the case when this album came out. That
Hmm.
is something that has happened since then. They didn't. This album came out. It. I think it barely cracked the top 50 albums in America. Uh, it didn't crack as far as like the like top 40 radio. It didn't make it onto top 40. None of the songs made it onto that. YouTube's first song that made it into top 40 was Pride in the Name of Love from the album after this,
Hmm.
which peaked at number 32.
So this
So
paved the way to that
it
success
paved the
afterwards.
way. It was more of a success at AOR radio and in certain markets in America, and it was a bigger success um in the UK than it was in North America. But YouTube were still flying pretty low as far as like public kind of awareness goes. So 1983, I'm a kid in grade 11 at Napanee District Secondary School. The music that was kind of everywhere at the time would have been John Cougar, probably even before he was John Cougar Mellencamp,
Mr. Mellencamp.
Mr. Mellencamp, Madonna, um, Van Halen, um, uh, Huey Lewis and the News,
Wow, this sounds nothing like those artists.
Michael Jackson. That was the stuff that was getting played on Kingston radio, which was the only radio I could pick up in Napanee. And my friend Graham McDonald, my dear friend, one of my oldest friends, who is currently the manager of Moist, we were friends way back then, and we were sitting in my mom's car, and he said, "You got to hear this." And he popped in the cassette of War, and the initial drums came in,
Sunday,
da da
Bloody
da da
Sunday.
da 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 da, and it was just so unlike anything I had ever heard. And up to that point, my favorite band probably then was Rush, which is and U2 is like there's just nothing at all like Rush. And I still love Rush. I've always loved Rush, but there was something so immediate. Everything about the vocal delivery, everything about the what he was saying, uh, where Neil Peart's like lyrics are uh small novels kind of thing. Uh, what Bono was saying was like it was straight from the heart, and it was like political in a way that I'd never heard music be. And I didn't. I mean, I was completely unaware of where U2 would have gotten their inspiration, like with bands like the Clash and that kind of thing. That was also not part of my Napanee experience, but everything it from the moment I heard it, I was just hooked. And U2 from that point became like my obsession. I was just completely consumed with everything that they were and that they stood for. And this album still it still is my favorite album of theirs, maybe my favorite album of all time. I can go through every note, every lyric of this album and defend it for why I think it's so great. But yeah, and that's, I remember going to, Graham gave me his U2 War t-shirt, and I was wearing it around Napanee District Secondary School, and everyone was like, what was this? The number U and the numeral, the letter U and the numeral 2. What does this mean? And I was trying to explain how wonderful it was. And fortunately, um, 4 years later, they were the biggest band in the world, and I didn't have to explain it anymore. But yeah, that was yeah. So the album came out in maybe January of '83, and I think that it was played for me in about April of '83. And yeah, I was a diehard, lifelong fan ever since that moment.
So this is another short and sweet album. The Led Zeppelin album had 8 songs. This has 10 songs, I believe. So
Yep.
it's like all killer, no filler.
Yeah.
This is
LP length. I love LP length when they had to keep the sides to 22 minutes aside. Yeah.
and this is the band's third album, and you mentioned this has a harsher sound than the two previous albums, and that harshness together with the political content with the delivery, it all added to that what's the word? Like what's the word? It felt so present, like
Yeah.
it,
It's
it
very
felt
immediate.
like immediate is the word
Yeah.
I'm looking for.
Yeah. And the other thing too is that obviously when this record blew my socks off, I immediately went back and bought Boy and October, the albums before it, and loved them as well. But um uh Boy's a great album too. It's definitely in my top 20 favorite albums of all time. Uh October's more atmospheric, but lyrically on those albums, they're more there's a lot of singing about their faith at the time, which I was completely down with all that as well. I thought that was great um, back then. Um, but the lyrics were more obscure, obtuse a little bit. The lyrics on War and the drum sounds, the drums are not atmospheric sounding, particularly not on Sunday Bloody Sunday. They're right. They're just right there. They're right at your head. There's nothing apologetic or hiding about it. It's an assault, and we don't. That song Sunday Bloody Sunday has become such a well known. Uh, such an anthem now. It's hard to remember how odd it sounded in 1983.
So you mentioned two of the singles already, New Year's Day and Sunday Bloody Sunday. There was two more singles, Two Hearts Beat as One and 40, the last song on the album.
Yeah.
Uh, Go ahead. Go ahead.
So Two Hearts Beat is One is another. Okay, actually, two things. I feel like this is a great album for again another bass player album. This is a great album for Adam Clayton. So many of the songs are are really driven by his bass parts, and later, certainly when we get into the Joshua Tree area stuff, he's playing a lot of just sort of basic quarter note, eighth note kind of support for what's going on rhythmically that the Edge is doing. Um, that's not the case with War. He gets to start doing fun stuff again when they get into the Acting Baby era. But like Two Hearts Beat is One is totally a bass driven song. New Year's Day is completely a bass driven song. Seconds is completely a bass driven song. Uh, you just mentioned it. 40 is completely a bass driven song, although apparently it's actually the Edge playing the bass on that song. But the bass parts are super important to the way these songs roll. And so it was very formative for me. I was just learning how to play bass at that time too. So I learned a lot of my bass playing lessons came from Adam Clayton and that album.
As I was listening, so I actually listened to this album on Sunday when I was driving to my parents for Thanksgiving. And I was going to mention that the bass just pops through, and the sound of the bass, there's like a clarity to it and a warmth to it. And I was going to ask you if that influenced you as a bass player with Moist, because I hear that crisp, clean bass sound with Moist.
Yeah, 100%. Definitely. Although yeah, I mean yeah, he's definitely certainly my favorite bass player until Adam Clayton came along was Geddy Lee. And
That's harder to play.
I could never aspire to be anything like Eddie Lee, so I had no desire to ever sound like him or be like him. But I mean, I remember uh, being in stage band, and the teacher was waiting for everyone to play their parts, and I would just be playing the bass part to two hearts beat is one. The bang bang ba do 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 do, because it's just a fun bass part. And another thing about two hearts beat is one is that I feel like it is the where like Sunday Bloody Sunday and Seconds and New Year's Day are very directly political songs. I feel like Two Hearts Beat is One is the closest that you two ever got to just a to singing a very direct love song. It's just a love song. Two Hearts Beat is One. It's a really simple sentiment. I mean, they did other songs that could be interpreted as love songs later on. Like you could think the one were one, but we're not the same as a love song. But it could also be,
What was the love song like years later? He wrote it to his wife as like an apology. The music video is him
yeah,
like driving in a car. So
the
he's like in
sweetest
the
thing.
sweetest
Yeah,
thing. That's what
yeah,
I'm thinking of.
yeah. That's true. Actually, that's even a
That's
little
like
bit
years
more.
later.
Yeah, that's more of a. Yeah, actually, you know what? Point taken. That's definitely more of a direct love song. But
Right, but that's this is
year
the
that's years
start.
later.
That's way
Yeah,
later. Yeah.
yeah. So two Hearts Beat is one is I don't know. It's very it's very direct, very and yeah. I wanted to mention that too because it's two Hearts Beat is one is a song that's always uh I've been very fond of for sure. Oh,
When
one other thing. Sorry, before we move on, I hope you're not tempted to move on because I want
No,
to
I
talk
got
about.
so much to say about this album still.
Okay, well, I want to talk about Drowning Man because Drowning Man, I would include in a conversation about that being the best song that U2's ever recorded.
Hmm.
It is if you listen to it intently at all, with sort of like you can see there's so much going on in that song. It's in a weird key signature. The bass comes in at a really weird spot compared to where everything's sitting. The there's a incredible violin part that's going on. The lyrics amazing. The production is incredible. I would put and Drowning Man. I would put up there with Zooropa from the title track from their 1993 album Zooropa as the two finest uh, songs that U2 ever recorded.
Wow, they have lots of great songs, so that's high praise.
Probably a controversial opinion again, but yeah,
I'll have to put another disclaimer
yeah.
across
Please do, please do.
that part. When you mentioned you had a U2 shirt you were wearing around school and kids were asking about it, it reminded me it's I don't know, years ago I heard that when U2 was choosing their band name, they just thought, what is the shortest band name we can come up with so we can have it as big as possible on a poster?
Yeah,
And U2, literally, it's like you can have the entire size of the poster with U2. Apparently, that's the only reason they
yeah,
went with U2. It's the shortest they could think of.
yeah. In fact, a friend of theirs who played in a band called the Radiators, a guy named Steven Averill, I think. There's another podcast that I'd love, which is all about the graphic design choices that were made for every U2 album. Um, and he apparently is the guy who suggested that name to them, and he suggested it with that exact thing in mind. As a graphic designer, he thought this is going to look great on a poster, on a T-shirt. When you guys are on the bill with other bands, your name is going to be the biggest because it's going to take up that much space as far as the I don't know. I'm not a graphic designer, but yeah, exactly that.
And you said this was kind of the start of U2 becoming one of the biggest bands in the world. So, it had kind of a slow start outside of the UK. It's their first album to finally go gold in the US. On its way to eventually, it sold 11 million copies. But you wonder how much is that going back since U2 became the biggest band, right? The whole discography
Absolutely.
ends up selling millions afterwards. So you
Yeah.
wonder at what point they sold 11 million
Yeah,
copies.
no, it was a gold album. They sold 500,000 copies of it over the course of its initial release, which is a big success, but not a huge success. 500,000 records is not enough that you can, retire on or even buy a house with or whatever. It's enough your label's making money, but the band's not making any money at that point. So yeah, that 11 million definitely came after the fact for sure. The other thing
And
too is that, sorry, I just want to come back to the importance. The other thing about about it for me is that I was so obsessed with the band that I started buying magazines anytime that there was a mention of U2 in a magazine. I would be buying it. So that got me buying magazines that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise, like UK publications and that kind of thing. And so it opened my world to a whole bunch of other bands from that side, that part of the world, bands that were like the part of the British post punk type thing, bands like Joy Division and Waterboys and Echo and the Bunnymen and that kind of stuff. So it was a huge kind of world opening moment for me.
And you were saying that they found success in the UK before here, and they actually knocked Michael Jackson's Thriller out of the number one spot in the UK,
In the
which is
UK,
wow.
they
The
did, yeah.
biggest, literally the best-selling album of all time. You two
Yeah.
knocked it out of number one.
Well, it was going to fall eventually. I couldn't stay there forever. So yeah,
Yeah, we
I'm
don't know.
glad it was them.
Maybe it was in week like 61
It
that
probably
it finally
was. Yeah.
knocked it out. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's too funny. And I have something here about the naming of why the album's called War. Um, I guess back in 1982, Bono said that it seems like war is the motif for this year. I guess there was wars breaking out everywhere around the world, and they decided to call the album War. There's the two singles, Sunday Bloody Sunday, New Year's Day. Both are political. And yeah, they just felt like war seemed to be what was on everyone's mind back at the time that they were writing this album.
Wow. I never heard that, but yeah, I guess so. I was 15, so I was completely unaware of that, but yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you were just listening to music in
Uh,
Napanee and
yeah, I was
life
just
was
listening to
good.
music and trying to figure, yeah, seeing this bigger world going on. So yeah.
This episode has been brought to you by the Women in the Music Industry podcast. It's hosted by music producer Rob Wells, who has worked with global superstars like Justin Bieber, Ariana Grande, and Selena Gomez. Through his 1 hour interviews, he shines a spotlight on the remarkable women who are breaking barriers and making their mark in the music industry. Some of his notable guests include Morgan Lander of the multi-million selling metal band Kitty, and Pam Shane, who co-wrote Genie in a Bottle for Christina Aguilera. If you're a fan of the Joel Martin Mastery podcast, you'll love the Women in the Music Industry podcast, which is available on all platforms. You mentioned to me that you've actually seen U2 several times in concert.
Yeah. So the first time I saw them was the uh the album that came out after that, the Unforgettable Fire tour, which came out in 1984, and they came to Ontario twice on that tour. They came in the December of 1984. They played Massey Hall in Toronto.
Wow, that would be so good, right? That's one of the best sounding venues in the world.
Oh, for sure. But I just couldn't figure out how to get there. It was Toronto was seemed like again at that point I was only 16, so it seemed like a long way to go. But then in the spring they came back and they played the Civic Center in Ottawa. Now the what do they call it now? The TD
PD
place.
place, yeah.
Yeah, and there was a bus tour that was run from Queen's University, uh, so to go to the show. So
From Kingston to Ottawa?
from Kingston, Ottawa, yeah, and so that was my I knew I could get there, and that was yeah. I remember waking up after that show and thinking, okay, I can die now. Now I've seen them
Yeah,
now.
my life is all downhill from
Yeah,
here on out.
and years later when I played that stage, um, I remember thinking, wow, I can't believe I'm actually playing the stage now where I that was so important to me all those years before. So yeah,
You too was just warming up for Moist years
yeah,
later.
exactly.
So then
Yeah,
you saw them a couple more times as
yeah. I
well?
saw the Acting Baby tour at BC Place, I think it was BC, whatever wherever the BC Lions play, big stadium there. And that was great. That was the the famous tour with the little cars suspended above the stage and Bono making prank phone calls from the stage and that kind of thing.
Ordering
Um,
10,000 pizzas?
ordering 10,000 pizzas. We did that in Chicago or something. Is that right?
Yeah.
Uh, and um, then I saw them again at the uh, Air Canada Center, Scotiabank Place, in I think on the tour on the
Is it Elevation at that point or
no, it was
no?
the album after that, the one with
How to Dismantle an
Uno,
Atomic
Dos,
Bomb?
Tres, yeah. Uno, Dos, Tres, Catorces, yeah. How to Dismantle the Atomic Bomb. Yeah, Vertigo. The Vertigo tour, I think it was called. Yeah,
Mm.
and that was great. I would see them again for sure. They're it's just tough to find time to get away, but yeah.
Yeah, I've man, sadly, they're one of the few bands that are considered all-time great live bands that I haven't seen.
Oh,
And
surprising.
I hear that it's like a religious experience when you see them live because of the way Bono is. I guess it's almost like he commands attention. He's a presence. It's almost like a pastor at church that's like speaking the word almost. I don't know. I've never seen it, so I'm
Yeah.
not explaining properly, but it sounds like you come back changed by this experience.
Yeah, no, he does a really good job of pulling the audience into the moment and making everyone who's there feel special. And part of that is I realized, quite a while ago, but that you two had they have a they developed a very clever thing in their songwriting very early on, which is that almost every single song that they've released as a single has a part of it that can be sung along with no words. So in Pride, it's oh 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 oh. In New Year's Day, it's what is it, New Year's Day? Maybe there's one New Year's Day, but but in With or Without You is oh. So there's a part that, and I swear I can't think of the other ones now, but there's a lot of songs that have that. So it gives the audience, whether or not they know the words or not, it gives them a moment where they can join in and sing along without having to worry about not knowing the words. And I think if you look at a U2 set list, you'll be surprised by how many of the songs have that feature in them. And even actually the very first song they ever released, which is a song called 11 O'Clock TikTok. And the version that they recorded is terrible, the one that came out in like 1979. But the version that's on the Live at Red Rocks album, which was the live album that they put out after the War album, has a great version of 11 O'Clock TikTok. And it's another one of my very favorite U2 songs. And even then, even though it was one of their very first songs, it has that moment of where the audience can sing along without knowing the words. And I think that's been a very critical part of their success in concert.
How amazing would it have been to see them at the Vegas Sphere? You know, they were the band to kick off what's now this worldwide phenomenon that
Yeah.
everyone's going to see. I'm a big UFC fan. They just became the first sporting event to do a live event there. And I think it's the Eagles that are there right now. I think the Grateful Dead or Dead and Company just
Dead and
did a
Co.
stint
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
So how cool would it have been with your experience seeing them three times, but then picturing what they could do with technology around them?
Yeah. Yeah. I heard a lot of reports from that show from people I know who went, and it sounds like like it sounds like it was everything that they hoped it would be. Like it was just a technological marvel. It's really weird. Like it's weird watching I don't know if you saw any clips of it on YouTube, but it's a very weird thing to look at because the stage is so not
So
like
minimalist.
so minimalist. Yeah. It doesn't look anything like a classic rock concert stage, but it's just a different thing. The whole thing it's all about the experience, the 360 immersive experience of the not 360, but 180 anyway, immersive experience with these massive screens in front of you and stuff. So yeah. Yeah. I thought about selling the house and going to one of those shows, but
Yeah, it's the UFC event. Tickets were like $15,000 or something ridiculous. So yeah,
right.
it was all a dream, you know, when they announced it.
Right.
I have one more point, just showing the acclaim that it had. Rolling Stone listed it at 221st on their list of 500 greatest albums of all time. So my point is saying it's considered one of the greatest albums of all
Yeah,
time.
sure. Yeah. Yeah. I believe it. Yeah, it deserves it.
So 1990s, we have Rheostatics Whale Music. This comes out in 1992. Uh, I will be honest, I was familiar with the band name, but I didn't know any of their music. So me listening to this album is the first time I've heard their music. So I wanted to come clean right off the bat that this is one of the reasons why I do this is so I can discover all-time great music that fell through the cracks in my life. So thank you for introducing me to this. But I had to come clean that I'm no expert on this album. I'm learning about it as we go here.
No, I know. I'm not surprised. I mean, you were what, like 8 or something like that? I mean,
Yeah,
1992.
seven.
So
Yeah, good
7,
call.
yeah. So, yeah. I mean, um, okay. What did you think of it when you listened to it?
So I thought it was unlike anything I had ever heard before, which is usually a compliment to a band that's unique, right?
Yeah,
So I've never heard anything like it. It was strange. It was unique. It was hard to pin down or categorize because I haven't heard anything like it. So I can't really fit it with any other
yeah,
band I've heard, which is cool.
absolutely. Yeah,
Um, there was a wide variety of sounds and genres and songs. It
yeah,
didn't just sound like 10 Led Zeppelin songs, or
yeah,
it sounded like a bunch of different musicians that have different styles and talents. And it felt like some musicians took lead on some songs, so they ended up this way, and some took lead on other songs. It felt like maybe they were a super group where different members took the lead on different songs. That's kind of the strangeness that came to me in a first time listen.
Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about Rheostatics, just so you can sort of because everything you're saying is kind of right. So they
You're
were
so
a
you're also educating probably our listeners that aren't familiar with this album. So
sure.
you're going to be educating me as well as all our listeners on why we should care and why we should go and listen to this album.
Yeah, and I want to say that this album, I've been listening to this album for 32 years now, and I've never not enjoyed it. I find it to be such an incredibly immersive, beautiful experience. It almost feels like a soundtrack to a film, although it's not. Uh, there is and hopefully people won't confuse. There is another Rheostatics album that is called music from the film Whale Music,
Just to
because
confuse people two
just to
years
confuse
later.
people, yeah, because they took the name of the album from a book by a author named Paul Corrington, and later on, and then they sort of themed. It's loosely based on various themes in the book, but extremely loosely. And then later on, uh, the the book was turned into a movie, and the filmmaker asked the Rheostatics to provide music for the movie. So there's also a music from the film Whale Music. Well, that's not the album Whale Music that I'm talking about. Uh, so back in the '90s, it was an incredible time for music in Canada, in that there was clubs all across Canada that were willing to book original bands. And so because of that, there was Canadian bands that were touring back and forth all the time. They could do the trip from Halifax to Vancouver, playing at small, maybe 300, 400, 500 seat clubs. And that was where Moist got its start in 1993. But one of the bands that was doing it a lot before us was Rheostatics, and they were kind of famous in the circuit, and you could count on them always being at the town pump in Vancouver every few months. They'd be out there, which is where I was living then, and even before then, we would see them at the Winchester Arms in Toronto, or the Horseshoe, that kind of thing. And they were just known as being this really great indie band, even though they were on Warner, but they were like an indie band, and they put on this incredible show that was quirky and that had um, just really great songs. There are 4 guys in the band, 3 of whom sing. So part of the sound of the record being so unique is that
Mm.
Martin, Dave, and Tim all have extremely unique voices and unique styles of songwriting. And the Dave songs are different than the Martin songs. They're different than Tim songs. They all have their own vibe. So it's almost like 3 singer songwriters who are sharing a band in a way. But the other thing is that when the Rheostatics played live, it was just the 4 of them playing. So two guitars, drums, bass, and three guys singing. And actually, the drummer Dave Clark also sang some and does some spoken word. The song "Guns" on the record is a spoken word piece with him, and then it's Neil Peart actually playing drums on that song. Um, and they were they're amazing to see live. But I remember like enjoying them live and thinking, "Oh, this is a great band," blah blah blah. And then again, same guy, Graham McDonald, was living in Vancouver at the time, and he had just bought he had a real job. Mark and I were living in a slightly different part of town. We were living more kind of we were trying to get the band going, and we were living a slightly more bohemian, kind of like poor sort of styled poor lifestyle,
Living in squalor.
living in squalor pretty much. And Graham had an actual job at the time, and he bought a Super NES. I think it was a Super, whatever the NES, whatever the Nintendo system before the N64
Yeah, so
was,
1991 was the SNES, Super Nintendo.
SNES, and he bought Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. And he said, "You got to come over and play this game with me." And so we had just been to see the Rheostatics probably the week before at the Town Pump, and we thought it was an amazing show. And he was like, "Hey, I got this Rheostatics album." And so we put it in and we fired up the game. And to this 30 years later, whenever I'm listening to Rheostatics, I can see the little Zelda character running in
Little
my mind.
pixels.
Yeah, little pixels, because it became the soundtrack to that. But we just had that album on repeat, and it sounded so different from, like, the songs are the same as they were playing them live, but the orchestration is just so much more dense, and there's guest vocalists, and there's string sections, and there's horn sections, and there's keyboard and everything. So they did just such an incredible job of translating it to record. And I've seen them play those songs many times before, and the songs live are great, but the recorded version is just another. It's just another world, another element. I can't. Anybody who hasn't had a chance to listen to this record, they just have to listen to it. There's probably no more record that I would recommend highly to anybody than Whale Music by Rheostatics.
You mentioned Neil Peart from Rush. So he's credited with percussion, arrangements, and drums. And I was curious if, because it doesn't, normally it says, track 1 and 7. This doesn't say any track. So I was wondering if he actually played on quite a few songs,
No, I think
just the one.
it's just the one. Yeah, it's just the song Guns, which is like somewhere in the middle of the album. It's also important to say there's 17 songs on this record, I think. So it's a dense listen. There's a lot to get through, and I feel like Guns is probably around number 10 or something like that. So yeah, and it's just basically a drum solo with the spoken word that Dave Clark's doing about guns, about the badness of guns. So yeah.
And then on top of the three singers in the band, uh, the Bare Naked Ladies are credited as doing backup vocals on the album, and they're credited as the Scarborough Naked Youth Choir.
That's
So,
awesome. I didn't know that. I do know that Michael Philip Jehoda, who produced the album, also produced Gordon by Bare Naked Ladies. So, and they're part of the same kind of Toronto indie scene. So it makes sense that they would know each other.
so I didn't realize that the band formed all the way back in 1978. Like I think the 90s when I think of this band, and which is, when this album came out, but they formed in 1978 and they were three of them. The band, no, all of them, when they first started, they were teenagers and needed special permits just to play their shows.
Wow, that's crazy. 78, really? That's
It says formed in 78 when I looked into it. So
okay. I mean, they're the same age as me, so they would be like 11 then, 12 then. I guess so. Yeah. All right, sure. I'll
yeah,
buy it. It's
maybe
on the
maybe
internet.
their prime was when they were 14, 15. I don't
Yeah,
know.
perhaps. Yeah. There is a bit of a clip of them playing uh like at the end. I don't know if you got to the end of the album. At the very tagline, there's like a hidden track, which is like a sound collage. And I think there's a bit of one of their first early performances on kind of buried in there, but you'd have to listen hard to find it.
And the album cover is unique. It's a painting of a whale biting another whale, and there's blood in the water. And the way the two whales are, it looks like the one biting might be the same one. It looks like it might be like I don't know. It's a strange painting of two whales, and it's actually the guitarist Martin that painted it, which I thought was
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, Martin's a very well respected painter. He did paintings. I think he painted most of their album covers. He's like a Toronto art fixture kind of thing. So they're all super interesting guys. Dave Bedini, I'm not surprised if you would know of him, if you like hockey, because he's written about sports a lot. Um, and uh, and Yeah, he's a big sports writer, big writer all around. Uh, yeah, and my favorite songs on this record, though, again, it's the bass player thing. Tim Vesely's the bass player, and he sings the songs that are probably my favorites, which is there's a song called "The Headless One," which is a really weird song. It starts off in 5/4, then it goes into 6/4, but you don't even really notice it. And he sings a song called "Palomar," which is a beautiful song about a man and his dog. And I find myself singing it all the time when I'm out walking my dog.
Man's best friend.
Paloma, what's wrong? Where'd your dog go? Yeah. Uh, and Soul Glue, another Tim song, which is just beautiful. But it that said, it's Martin is the thing that makes the band sound unique. Even on the Tim songs, his voice singing harmony is he's got this really high. I don't know if it's a falsetto or if it's just a really unique full voice. And live, he back in those days anyway, he was playing this really weird, kind of like a headless guitar that he would just get all these really weird sounds out of and stuff. So where Tim would be playing, sorry, not Tim, where Dave would be playing either regular acoustic guitars or electric guitars. Martin would be getting these strange sound things out of this, like a like a weird headless kind of strange guitar. So yeah,
I thought the song Kings of the Past had really good guitar work on it.
I'm the king of the past. Yeah, King of the Past is great song, beautiful. And actually, that the way that song, yeah, like songs they all have beautiful endings too. Like King of the Past has an incredible ending part to it. We're like a coda almost. It's just yeah, it's every song has something unique and incredible about it. So um to anybody like who hasn't heard this and wants to find some really good music, just take a moment when you're driving your car and you have an hour to kill and just start it from the beginning. Because like the way it begins with a self-service gas station, and the other thing too about the album is that it represents so many genres. There's
Yeah.
a bit of country in there. There's a bit of punk rock. There's a lot of like indie. There's a lot of songs that are in really crazy time signatures like 6/4, 5/4, that kind of thing. It is it's everywhere. It's amazing.
And so the band had just one top 40 hit with the song Claire,
Claire, yeah.
but despite only having one hit, they're considered one of Canada's most influential and unconventional rock bands.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah, they were such a big deal in the 90s. Like they were an inspiration to all of us, I think. And Claire's a beautiful song as well. And Claire was actually it was on their next album. Introducing Happiness was the album that came after that. And it's a great song. And it was actually like a reasonable pop hit for them. And it was also featured in the movie um Whale Music as well. The movie that was made from the book. Yeah. So yeah, and Claire is a beautiful song as well. If you haven't checked it out, it's like a gorgeous song.
And it sounds like they've reunited and they're still playing shows. Have you heard
Yeah,
that or?
yeah, they're playing. I don't know if they ever stopped playing. Like they have gone through, like they've taken breaks for sure. But I noticed that they were playing um, like they were playing a winery in Prince Edward County. I noticed last summer, maybe no, maybe it was the summer before. They played Skelton Park here in Kingston about 5 years ago. I think the same kind of thing as so many other 90s bands where they kind of get together and play when it's convenient for everybody because everyone has other lives and other things going on. Um, to the best of my knowledge, I think Michael Philip Wojciechowski, who is the producer, is now playing drums for them, and Dave Clark has moved on to other things. I say that as if it's news, but I think that was probably about 15 or 20 years ago that happened. So
So it sounds like their newest album was about 5 years ago. So Here Come the Wolves was in 2019.
right.
So if you guys like whale music, there's another album, Here Comes the Wolves, you can check out that's a little fresher from a few years ago. And there's a little bit of critical acclaim here. So the Canadian Music Magazine Chart conducted a reader poll to determine the greatest Canadian albums of all time. Whale music placed fourth behind Joni Mitchell, Neil Young, and Sloan. And then the fifth album was the same band with their 1991 album Melville.
Melville.
So in the
Melville's a
top
great
five,
album as well. That's
top
incredible.
five, they have two albums in the top five with Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, and Sloan. Like what more can you ask for from a band?
Yeah, that's pretty amazing for sure. It certainly isn't like the fact that I'm a huge fan of it. I'm not alone in this at all. This is a very well respected album. It's just it's not it hasn't hit any kind of mainstream popularity, but those of us who know it, we we love it. So yeah, it's definitely you got to yeah, it's definitely it needs to be checked out. Yeah, and you need to spend some time with it. It's really it's a dense album, but it's like I say, I've been listening to it for 32 years, and I'm still hearing things sometimes that I haven't heard before when I listen to it.
So I have two final quotes about the album. So it sounds like the band was so eclectic that the labels didn't know how to promote them properly because they couldn't, again, they couldn't pigeonhole them into a certain thing to market. And then directly speaking about that, Bobby Baker from the Tragically Hip in 1997, he said, I think maybe they're a little too good for their own good. As in, like they're so talented, but they won't conform to something that is easier to market.
Sure, and it could be one of those things too with the three singers, like three guys who write songs, and so no one knows who to you know the
Hmm.
labels don't know who to pick as the guy to focus on. Like of the three guys, sorry, of the four guys, including Dave, including the drummer, like Martin is he on stage. It seems like he is the most obvious person who is the band leader. He sort of commands the most attention with his voice. His voice is the most unique and that kind of thing. Dave is the most kind of conventional, like singer songwriter kind of guy, and he's the guy who sings all the more kind of punky songs. And he's also the guy who's really well known for being an author and that kind of thing. He's always out doing stuff and that kind of thing. But but they're only like top 40 hit was sung by Tim, who was the bass player. And so that was kind of unexpected because he's got the most conventionally beautiful voice. Um, and but I think it was unexpected that he would be the guy who would be singing the song that was their biggest charting success.
So let's dive into the 2000s. So in 2007, Radiohead releases In Rainbows. This is actually on my list of favorite albums of all time. So I'm happy that you chose this. Uh,
We can go real deep on this one then for sure.
let's do it.
Yeah.
I guess where to start? What makes this a great album amongst a discography that has, arguably four of the greatest albums of all time in it?
Okay. Well, here's the weird thing about this album. This is my favorite album from the aughts, from the 2000s and the 2000 yeah, things. But it might not be my favorite Radiohead album. I like it's I could easily argue for the Benz Kid A. I could have picked Kid A actually because it's too, but I don't
OK
know.
Computer,
And
arguably their
and
best.
OK Computer. OK Computer is probably it probably is my favorite Radiohead album. But like OK Computer has it is like solid all the way through. The only kind of skippable thing on OK Computer is the Fitter Happier, which
The
kind of gets a
computer
little bit
talk,
yeah, the computer talk.
better,
But
happier,
the
stronger.
songs on that album are just intense. The Bends is just I remember the first time I heard about the Bends, we were touring in England in like 1994, 1995, 1995. And one of the bands that was playing with us, that was touring around with us, um, I was talking to him and he goes, hey, have you heard there's a new Radiohead album? And I was like, oh, really? Like, I mean, we all knew Creep, and that was all we knew about Radiohead. And it seemed they could have easily been a one hit wonder with that thing. And the guy goes, yeah, like it's called the Bends. Like you got to check this out. And I said, oh, I was kind of dismissive. I was like, okay, well, you know what? They're on the same label as us. So next time I'm in the EMI offices, I'll grab a copy from the cupboard. And he was like, no, you don't understand. Like this is an album that people are going to be talking about 30 years later.
Wow.
And here we are talking about it 30 years later. And like who knew? I mean, the band set the stage for everything else, but you couldn't have expected OK Computer. Then you couldn't have expected Kid A, which is I could easily argue for Kid A being my favorite too, except there's a few things in that are a little more difficult to listen to. But even on the strength of National Anthem alone, or Everything in its Right Place, like those are just incredible, amazing songs. Uh, but for the 2000s, my favorite is definitely In Rainbows, and definitely In Rainbows is definitely tied, maybe close to the top with OK Computer as the ultimate favorite. And I like again its succinctness. 11 songs, I think, right? 45 minutes. It's not drawn out at all. Every song has a place. There's no filler in it. Every song is unique in a really like unusual way. And I really dug that this is kind of, although there's really great atmospheric stuff in it, this is kind of their return to guitars in a way. And there's certainly songs that don't have guitars featured that predominantly, but then you get into a song like Body Snatchers or Jigsaw Falling into Place, where it's just like guitars, like and guitars like sorry, I'm going on a bit, but the great thing about Radiohead in their mid period, like the period after OK Computer, and going up into and including In Rainbows, is that they became a band where people were okay sitting out in the band, where like one guy would be okay sitting out an entire song. There's a lot of really sparse recordings in there. It doesn't sound like five people happening, and that there's a lot of songs on In Rainbows that are like that as well. But there's also the sound of all five of them playing together at the same time, and it's just so powerful and amazing when they do that.
It's such a atmospheric and a beautiful album. Like you can't call that many albums beautiful, but there's something about it that is just spacious and haunting and beautiful at the
It's
same
warm
time.
too. It's a warm sounding album, like especially when you get into um, infrastructure will collapse. So I'm bad with song titles, but uh,
House of Cards or
yeah, House of Cards, uh, and Strange Fish, that are the arpeggi Strange Fish, Weird Fishes. Um, like there's a warmth to it that's really like beautiful. It is a soundscape kind of
All
thing.
I Need is really warm
Oh
with
my god,
bass.
yeah. All I need, yeah. Well, sorry, that's the other thing about and Nude with bass too. That bass part. That's the other thing about this album is that I've always loved Colin Greenwood's bass playing, but I feel like In Rainbows is his best bass playing album. Like the choices he makes on this album are incredible, and the places where he joins in with what's going on with the guitars and stuff, where he sort of leaves the bass and kind of like leaves the low end and goes up and joins things or does a little thing, like a little riff, little run. It's an incredible album for him. Like yeah, good job, Colin, on this one.
You mentioned Creep from before and Nude now. What's funny is Nude was Radiohead's first top 40 single since Creep, all the way back in whatever that was, 92 or 93.
No, really? They
Yeah.
didn't chart?
So they had big, they had number one modern rock
Sure,
singles,
yeah,
number one
right.
alternative singles, but on the actual Billboard Hot 100, where you have your Beyoncés and your Justin Biebers, it's their first time cracking the top 40 on the Hot 100 of every genre chart since Creep.
Unbelievable.
Yeah,
So 16 years later or something like that.
yeah,
Wow, that's insane. Wow. I didn't know that.
yeah. Do you remember when this album came out and it was the first major album where they did a pay what you can? Do you remember
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, and I have to admit that I only came upon this record uh like I only started really getting into it probably about maybe 10 years ago, like which is about 13 years after it came out kind of thing, or hang on, that math doesn't work out. I probably ignored it for 10 years before I really got into it because, or not 10 years, but because I thought it was kind of a gimmick. I didn't think like the whole thing, and I kind of had it in the back of my mind that, well, if it's pay what you can, then or pay what you want, then is it really that great? And I'd kind of fallen off them a little bit from um, after Kid A. Oh, Hail to the Thief. What was that? What was after Kid A?
So they had Amnesiac, which was
Amnesiac.
just extra songs from the Kid A
Yeah,
sessions.
I fell off them there.
Yeah.
I fell off them in Amnesiac, and
But
I just
also Hail to the Thief wasn't up to par, generally speaking, as their greatest albums.
right.
So
Yeah, yeah. So, but I mean, I know that it was a big deal. Like it was a big deal. This whole pay what you can thing, and uh, I was thinking about that after the fact. Like that was it was kind of before the iTunes store came out.
So iTunes was 2004. This
Okay.
was 2007. But what happened was between iTunes in 2004 and Napster, it's like people weren't buying albums anymore anyways.
Yeah.
So Radiohead with Hail to the Thief in 2003, they finished their contract with EMI.
Right.
And New York Times at that point described Radiohead as by far the world's most popular unsigned band. So they were trying to figure out what to do moving forward. And EMI was backing up the truck, trying to give them all the money in the world. But EMI wanted the masters. EMI wanted some, quality control on
Right.
it.
Yeah.
So they decided, well, we don't want to sign away our stuff to a major label. And then currently the market, people aren't buying albums anyways. So why don't we try an experiment where we own the music? If people are just going to download it for free and there's leaks and all that, we can be the ones to leak it. And that way, the whole world gets to hear it at the same time because we're releasing it. And technically, even if you don't have money, you can legally download it. So it was just this big experiment. And what's cool is you could pay anything from $0 up to whatever you want. And there's all this psychology behind it where if you even said, oh, it's starting at $1, any amount, everyone would pay a dollar. But when you say zero, it's like
Zero. Right.
it's you give so much freedom that most people on average paid like $4 to $8 because they felt like, oh, it's my choice and I would like to thank them with $5. So they ended up making $3 million instantaneously from the free, starting at free pay what you can release. They said they made more in that 1 week than they made from the entire rollout of Hail to the Thief with a major
Right.
label. So
Yeah. Oh my God. Wow, that's crazy. Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty cool. I mean, it was definitely revolutionary and it made news for sure. But because of that, I kind of stayed away from the album for many years, and I shouldn't have. It was yeah when I discovered it, uh, yeah, about 10 years ago. I can't remember how it came to me. I couldn't believe how good it was. I was like just amazed, like right from track one. It just like yeah, it kind of reminded me more of Kid A than I thought it was going to.
because
So
there's still the electronic undertones.
there is, yeah, it's definitely got electronic undertones, but there's more of the band playing on top of it. So which is great, and like I said, the guitars and the yeah, it's such an amazing piece of work. And lyrically, there's something about it lyrically too that um the songs make me really sad and it really
Yeah. It
like it
feels
really
it feels more vulnerable than a lot
yeah
of their other music.
it feels very personal. Like it feels like Tom's actually singing about himself in a way that I don't recall him ever doing.
Instead of such grandiose
Yeah,
lyrics. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, the only other time I remember him really singing about himself was probably Creep. You know, like after that, it gets pretty kind of storytelling, abstractions, science fiction, whatever, like all this sort of stuff. It sounds like it sounds like he's really grappling with mortality on the album as well. And it could just be that's I probably had heard it back in 2007, um, but maybe I just wasn't ready for it then.
You didn't listen with an open heart back
No,
then.
I didn't listen to it with open heart, and definitely in the last 10 years, I've been way more open to it, and again, it's another one of those albums where every time I listen to it, I hear something different and new that I hadn't heard before. There's so much going on, even on the songs that are super sparse. There's so much going on.
What I found surprising is even after they released it on their own, where anyone could get it for free or for a dollar, whatever you want to pay, they still months later, they did sign, a distribution deal to
Yeah.
physically get the album in stores. And despite, millions of people already having purchased it or gotten it, it still debuted at number one on the Billboard, top 200 charts. And it still went on to sell 3 million copies worldwide. And you think, they tried this indie experiment instead of them selling, 2 million copies of their albums like they normally do, maybe they sell 200,000 copies or something. It still went on to sell 3 million copies.
Wow. It's a great album for vinyl too, because it's another 10 song or again, 10 or 11 songs. I can't remember, but 45 minutes probably. It fits nicely on one record and seems like it's tailor made for that kind of thing. What about when did you find the record? Did you find it in 2007 or
Yeah. Yeah.
did you
I
pick
remember because the year it came out, it I was already a big Radiohead fan, so I was ready for it. And then I remember as a musician releasing my own album, I was always big into marketing, which is where I was saying, Moist guitarist Mark, his book was like my indie Bible. The indie Bible, I used to read that to learn how to market myself as a band. And so I was always looking at different promotion techniques and marketing techniques and campaigns. So I got right into what Radiohead was doing and trying to figure out if we can do that as well.
right?
So
Yeah.
so I was in the loop right off the bat, and I remember that year, I could be wrong, but I think Feist put out the remainder that year with 1 2 3 4, the song that was in all the Apple commercials.
Yep.
And I could be, revisionist history or whatever, but I remember it was essentially Radiohead in Rainbows and Feist the Remainder were the two albums fighting for every award that year. So on every list of the best albums of the year from Rolling Stone or
Right.
Billboard, it was one and two, Feist and Radiohead. I think for the Grammys, album of the year, Feist, Radiohead. And I could be remembering it wrong, but I just remember those two albums kind of dominated everything that year, and both are all-time great albums.
Yeah, absolutely for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, man, besides selling and the critical acclaim, it won a bunch of Grammys. It was nominated for a bunch more that it didn't win. And then the reviews, it's considered an all-time great album, which is you think that when a band like Radiohead that already has the Bends and OK Computer and Kid A,
Kid
that
A.
those
Yeah.
three are considered three of the greatest albums of all time, you figure it'd be almost impossible to put out a new album that somehow is also on all the lists of greatest albums of all time, but that's what they did. So the album comes out and it was ranked one of the best albums of the year and of the decade by most publications. Entertainment Weekly called In Rainbows the gentlest, prettiest Radiohead set yet, and stated that it uses the full musical and emotional spectra to conjure breathtaking beauty. Rolling Stone had it in its list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. Yeah, I'd have it in my for sure my top 20 greatest albums of all
Yeah.
time. It probably slides in at the bottom end of the top 10. I'd have to think about it. Luckily, I've had all these guests where they share their top five. Nobody's made me sink my teeth into what are my top five, so it's hovering around the
That's
the 10
yeah.
area, I
Someday
think.
you'll have to do that sometime.
Yeah, yeah.
You're the Joel Martin top five of all time. You'll have to come to terms with that.
Then I'll know why my guests are always squirming so hard
Yeah.
when I try to get them to commit to their
But
albums.
that is another thing that's really kind of that you skated on there, which is that it came out 10 years after OK Computer. Came out 12,
13.
13,
Okay, Computer was 94, 97,
97,
97. So
okay.
10 years
97,
later.
10 years later.
You're right. Sorry.
So 12 years after the Bends. So here's a band after the Bends could have easily been thought of at the time as being this band is never going to
Top. Yeah.
hit another, yeah, never going to hit a creative zenith like this again. And 12 years later doing it, it's like a U2 type situation where, where U2 releases, um, War in '83 and Joshua
Joshua
Tree
Tree.
in 90, in '87 and Octa Maybe in '91 and All You Can Leave Behind in 2001. Like so,
Yeah.
or 2000. So same kind of Same kind of thing. They're on the same kind of. They're in the same conversation as you two, as far as like all time bands. Just for the having that, just for that length of importance that they've been able to maintain.
And you saw Radiohead live on the tour for arguably their greatest album.
Yeah, at the beast at the Bell Place, Center Bell in
Centre Bell.
Centre Bell, and yeah, and I was astounded. It was like so. It was I had no idea what to expect, and it was mind blowing. And you said you saw Hail to the Thief tour,
So what's funny is I also saw them in Montreal,
also at
uh,
Centre Bell.
and it was Hail to the Thief, that tour, but it was actually twice the size of your show. So they played outside. I think it was Parc Olympique or the Island or something where it was
Yeah,
outside. And, normally you go to a festival and there's 10 big bands on the bill, and all 10 bands together draw 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 people. This was just Radiohead and there was 60,000 people.
wow, holy cow, wow, yeah. There's a lot of love for this band for sure. I think that
That,
they're the band that I keep on thinking. Um, if they if they start doing shows again, if they reunite and do it again, they're on the bucket list as a band I need to see one more time. Because it's another one of those bands where they you almost take for granted that they're gonna have another chance until you realize that they haven't been around for 10 years touring, and you start to think, oh my god, this might be maybe I missed it. Maybe there won't be a chance again. And another situation too where it's the same five guys for so long, and yeah, and everybody in that band has an important place and does an important thing.
yeah, the show that I saw in Montreal, I'd have it in my top three concerts I've ever seen, and I'd have it as the best light show I've ever seen.
Yeah.
There was a point during Paranoid Android where, eventually it like breaks down and it's all the choir voices. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
they shot out the brightest pure white lights where you were blinded, and with that heavenly choir, it just felt like that was you being accepted up into heaven. It was like the craziest moment that I remember.
Amazing. That's so cool. Yeah, I got to see that again for sure.
So we've made it all the way to your final album. So in the 2010s, we have Hamilton, the original Broadway cast recording. This comes out in 2015. I'm gonna be honest, it's funny, someone that's a musician, someone that's musical, I generally don't like musicals. Every time I watch a musical, I find them kind of they're kind of campy, they're kind of cheesy. It feels like the music is like old and doesn't hold up anymore. I always find myself when I'm watching a musical, I'm thinking, man, I really wish they would just speak their lines like actors instead of singing them. So I'm a harsh critic going into a musical. And you asked me, you said, man, you got to watch it. It's amazing. So it's on Disney Plus. So you can go watch Hamilton now on Disney Plus. And within 15 minutes, it was by far the greatest musical I have ever seen. I not only didn't hate it, I was actually loving it. And I was telling myself, I'll do the first 30, it's almost 3 hours. So I'm like,
It's long. Yeah.
I'll do the first 30 minutes or I'll do 45 minutes. And just every song would go into the next one. I'm like, oh, this is amazing. And there was a hip hop flavor and it felt fresh. And the acting was great and the singing was great and the rapping was great. And
And the
I was
story. What about the
enthralled,
story?
I was enthralled by it. And yes, absolutely the story as well. So I could talk a lot about it, but I guess for you, this is kind of the odd choice amongst your five albums. Can you maybe share a little bit about your experience with the play and or the soundtrack?
Yeah. So I mean, the weird thing about it is weird in my five albums, but I've it's kind of not weird as far as my personal taste goes because I've always loved musicals. I mean, one of my very first musical experiences that I remember was going to see Sound of Music with my parents at the Kingston Grand Theater and being completely blown away by that. And later on, I was big time into Jesus Christ Superstar and not just musicals, but also like rock operas, like Tommy and and that kind of thing. It's because it's not that different. A rock opera and a modern musical are not that far removed from each other. Um, and yeah, so I mean, I like the classics. I like the classic musicals, and I love some of the modern ones. Come From Away, which is a Canadian production, is also an incredible music, incredible thing. And actually, just kind of off topic, but kind of not. When I was at Queens in first year university, I may or may not have told the story when we did our deep dive, but I was dying to get into a rock band. I was in first year and I was living in residence, and but I was so kind of focused on just my classes and kind of trying to get through that first year thing that I never didn't put up a poster or do anything to try to figure out how I was going to get into a rock band. But I was in drama class, and the first year drama students were going to be putting on a writing and putting on a musical. And so I went out to that and got totally involved and ended up being the composer for this musical that was written by all these first year students that we then put on at a theater at the end of the year. And one of the so it was a I wrote I think 6 songs for it, and I still remember them. They're not bad. I was 18 years old though, so they're not great, but they're not bad, and they're definitely of the rock opera kind of musical kind of vibe. Um, but Mark McAway was in the audience on the night of the performance, and he was turns out he had a mutual friend, and he says that he remembers being in the audience and thinking to himself, I should start a band with that guy. And so he got invited to the cast party because he was friends with another person who was in the play. And he came up to me and said, "Hey, you know what? I play guitar. Do you want to start a band?" And that was the beginning of what would turn into Moist. So
Without musicals, there's no Moist.
that's what I'm
I have
saying.
a
This is
newfound
what
respect for musicals.
this is
I
exactly
didn't
what
know
I'm
their
saying.
importance in the lore of Canadian rock history.
Yeah. Now Mark would deny this story. Well, he wouldn't deny it, but he still hates musicals. Kevin loves musicals though. Uh, but yeah. Anyway, so I came into Hamilton uh, as if it was a rock opera. I came into it without having seen the play. As you may or may not know, it was like impossible to see it back in the day. It was the most difficult when it was only on Broadway. Tickets were almost impossible to come by. Uh, but the album came into being, and I think that was my wife had suggested. My son's really into history, so at that point in time, he's 9 years old or something, and he's really into history. And she had heard about this thing and gave him some links to some songs. And so I heard him playing it. And so I actually and I was hearing the songs kind of out of order and thinking, oh, these are pretty good. I don't know what the context is. So one day when I had to drive to Toronto, I cracked open Apple Music and fired it up. And the one thing about it as a musical is that it doesn't require, it's a completely sung through musical. It doesn't require any dialogue to get the story. And I just couldn't believe it. It was the quickest 3 hour drive of my life, just because the songs are so incredible and the story's so compelling, and it's got everything. It's got war, and it's got politics, and it's got a
Adultery.
adultery and a love triangle, and oh my god, and the songs, the Dear Theodosia song that they sing, that when he and Burr sing it to their newborn kids, is like, it just brings tears to my eyes every time. And yeah, so that was like probably 2018. In 2019, we decided that we were definitely going to go see it in 2020, and we bought tickets to go see it on Broadway for, I think it was March 21st, 2020. Basically, the idea is that I was going to come home from recording the new Moist album, pick up the family. It was March break, and we were going to drive to New York. And my wife was calling me as I was in the studio, like, "Do you think we should go? Like, what if the borders closed? Blah blah blah." And of course, as we were in the studio, I got a message from Ticketmaster saying that the shows have been canceled. So we didn't have to decide. So I still haven't seen it live, but fortunately, through the good graces of Disney and in collaboration with Lin-Manuel Miranda, it popped up on Disney, the whole play experience, a year later or something like that, so we could all watch it that way. But my point is that I still came into it as if it was an album, not as a play, not as a film. I came to it as an album before I came into it as anything. So
And what was your initial reaction finally seeing it as a play on Disney?
I loved it. I thought it was amazing. Like I thought the staging, the performances, uh the you could sort of hear it when you're listening to it, but the way they use the chorus, like the people who are in the background singing stuff, where they're not just simply singing oohs and ahs and pumping up the important bits of dialogue. They're also being used as sound effects and as percussion and as atmosphere and there's all kinds of sort of like lore that goes on in the as you sort of dive in as you get into Hamill fandom, which I'm unfortunately well into. There's things you learn, like there's one stage chorus member who is known as the Bullet, who is constantly moving around and is very close, sort of representing all the times that Alex or any other character escapes death, basically, until the very end when, spoiler alert, when Hamilton gets killed.
Oh,
Um,
spoiler.
yeah, it happened 250 years ago, so so hopefully it's not news to too many people, but yeah. So did you get through the whole thing?
I did. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, good. So
Yeah.
like the musical callbacks, like the way that the various themes kind of call back to each other, and the fact that um each of the characters has their own like musical theme. Like Alexander Hamilton's theme is Alexander Hamilton, and Angelica's theme is Angelica, and Eliza's theme is Eliza, and those little like musical phrases are like wound into their performances and their songs, their entries and that kind of thing. And when you sort of dial into that, the whole thing, the more you listen to it, the more you hear, and the more you get kind of into the way it's composed, and the yeah, it's an incredible piece of work.
Man, I'm watching it and it just feels like there's this touch of genius involved, this level of mastery that's it seems impossible that a human being or several human beings even created this. So let me break this down for a second. It's hard enough for a musician or a band to write one great song, and then it's even harder to have one great album. And then if you want to do a Pink Floyd The Wall, or The Who Tommy, or a concept album, it's that much harder to not just make a great album, but to have every song flow from one to the next to tell a story. Maybe the best song to kick off the album is actually track 7, but it's like lyrically it doesn't go there, and it just adds to how much more complicated things are. And then I'm watching this musical, and again, it's not just being able to write one good song, but there's like 50 songs in this musical. And then it's again, they all have to go in order, and they have to tell an insanely complicated story. And there's
That
50
takes place over 20 years as well.
right.
Yeah,
And there's 50 characters. So it's also who is singing which song, which means what key it has to be in. And then they don't just have it where one person sings one song. It's dialogue back and forth where half of the time a character is finishing phrases of the other person. So it's not like you sing a line, I sing a line. It's like you sing the first 3 words of the line and I sing the last two. Like
yeah,
the amount of mastery going on over a 3-hour period, I can't even fathom the amount of genius and work
yeah,
for this to even exist.
yeah, yeah. I was listening to it this morning, or yeah, this morning, for the 50th time, and sorry, maybe 500th time, and I was thinking about as well that in even in because they cover so much time, there's some songs where over the course of a 4 minute song they move through several years of time, and like one of the examples of that is a song like the song where they introduce Washington, the "Here Comes the General," the Right Hand Man song, and it gets into the whole bit. So it begins with the beginning of the Revolution, and then he introduces George Washington as a character, and George Washington does this thing, we're a gunned up man, blah blah blah, and then it talks about Hamilton's role and about the British invading New York, and about Hamilton being involved in the battle there and stealing these British cannons. And then he goes to Washington and says, Washington calls him and says, "I need you to help me do this thing." And then Burr comes in, and Burr gets all angry because, or not angry, but he's just kind of, George is very dismissive of him. And so it's several years of stuff that happens condensed into this 1 4 minute bit in such an incredible way. And the other time that happens is when, um, in second act, when the scholars, when Angelica's moved off to London and she comes back to visit, and there's a whole thing that happens there where Hamilton's supposed to be getting his Congress bill through and his debt plan through, and the sisters want him to go away on holiday and he can't do it, and all this sort of stuff. And it's a thing where like several months are compressed into just like a few bars in a way that's really masterful and really clever and so cool. And yeah, sorry, your turn. I could wax on about this thing forever.
Oh, I just want to blast through the amount of critical acclaim, but also the commercial success. So, it's one of the most successful Broadway musicals of all time, but I didn't realize the success it had even with the recordings and the songs. So I'm just going to blast through this. So Hamilton came out, crazy critical acclaim. It won the Grammy for Best Musical Theater Album. It was certified diamond in
Holy
the US.
wow.
It's the only musical to be certified diamond. I think there's 94 diamond albums ever in the US, and they're your typical Michael Jackson, Beatles, Eagles, Pink Floyd. Like, it's the usual suspects. So to have a musical as a diamond album, I was not expecting that. Almost every song on the album, and there's, I don't know, 50 songs, almost every song individually has gone gold, platinum, or multi-platinum. It's the best-selling cast album of all time. It's the highest charting cast album since Hair in 1969. It spent 250 consecutive weeks on the Billboard Top 200. I didn't know any of this. It's considered one of the best musicals ever. And I keep seeing Lin-Manuel Miranda that you mentioned. He seems like that genius to me when it comes to musicals because you see him, he worked on In the Heights, Hamilton, Moana, Encanto, Tick Tick Boom, like all the greatest, musicals and animated films of the last so many years. He keeps popping up as the guy that knows how to write those kind of songs. So I don't
Yeah.
know if you have anything to say about him, but he
No,
seems
but
like this genius when it comes to musicals.
yeah.
Somehow that's his niche and he's the guy.
But also for like 4 years or something, like 4 years, he had to do 8 shows a week being Hamilton in his play Hamilton. So he's like, not only did he have to compose the thing, but he had to star in it as well. And that as the title star of that thing, he has far more stage time than anybody else. So it's kind of not surprising that he hasn't there hasn't been another musical by him. Like he, I don't know if you when you have a moment, there's a really great clip on YouTube of him. Uh, he's at a dinner for the that's hosted by the Obamas, and he introduces the fact that he's working on a new play, and he and just a piano player sing perform the very first song, uh, like the way it kicks off. So it's just him with the thing, and it's really like it's just this idea, and it took him like I think it took him 3 years to write it or something like that. It's an incredible work, absolutely amazing, and I can't even imagine the amount of workshopping that they had to do to get it all figured out and stuff. So I really wanted to. It's the most kind of there's two parts of the thing that I always find so incredibly compelling every time we listen to it. The first is the how clever it is the 10 dual commandments bit, which happens 3 times in the song, where it explains exactly how a duel works because there's 3 duels in the musical, and every time the song that's played is a variation of the 10 dual commandments thing. And I just find it so clever that there's like, there's 10 paces to a duel, and they break it into these 10 things, and every section is one of these things and explains how it works. It lays it out, so you don't have to show the entire duel happening on stage. You could sing about it instead, which is pretty cool. And the other thing, the 2 songs that in a row that always get me because I find it just so clever, is in the middle of Act One, there's a song called Helpless, which is sung by Hamilton's future wife Eliza. And then right after that is a song called Unsatisfied, which is sung by her sister,
The
Angelica,
jealous sister.
the jealous sister. And it's a bit of a pulp fiction style, bit of twisted of time where we see the one time frame happening and then the whole thing rewinds and Angelica tells the story from her perspective. So we hear the story from Eliza as she's getting married about how Angelica introduces her to Hamilton. And then we hear it from Angelica's perspective in Unsatisfied, where she tells it from her perspective about how she was in love with Hamilton, but knew that because of her social stature, there's no way that, and because he was penniless, there's no way that they can make it work. So she introduced him to her sister so that she could keep him in her life, but she'll never be satisfied. And it's just everything about it is just like gut wrenching and so good, but beautiful and musically amazing. And yeah, I find it just astoundingly good.
So as soon as I started watching, I recognized a bunch of the actors, and it turns out that Hamilton was the springboard for these actors to go on to do the movies and TV shows where I became familiar with them. So,
Right.
three examples. A friend of mine really wanted to go see the movie Twisters. So I went with him, and it's this big blockbuster hit. And Ramos, Anthony Ramos, he
Yeah.
plays John Lawrence and Philip Hamilton.
Yeah.
He's one of the leads in Twisters.
Yeah.
So I recognize him right away. And then Jonathan Groff, who plays the king, who's like the funny guy in the
Yeah.
show. He's the lead in Mindhunter on Netflix about serial killers, like a very dark. It's like the history of how the FBI started a division to learn about serial killers.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and
He also
that's
voices Olaf in Frozen as well.
Oh, that's awesome. And then the last one is Leslie Odom Jr., who plays Aaron Burr. He played Sam Cooke in One Night in Miami, where he was up for the Academy Award for the Golden Globe for Best
Oh, wow.
Actor. So I saw that movie as well. So right away I'm watching, and I knew Lin-Manuel Miranda, and then I saw the other three actors. I was like, oh, I'm actually familiar with these actors as well. So.
Yeah, I think it's been a good sort of starting point for a lot of people's careers for sure.
So I have
So,
two final things, and then we'll wrap this up. So just some acclaim from Billboard and Rolling Stone. So when it came out, Billboard gave the album an eye-popping debut, giving it a 5 out of 5 star review and listing it at number 2 on the magazine's 50 best albums of 2015. And then Rolling Stone gave it a 4.5 out of 5 star rating, listing it at number 8 on the magazine's top 50 albums of 2015. So just a little more acclaim to wrap it up with a bow.
nice. Awesome. That's great. Yeah. And again, I think it's a lot of people are afraid of musicals a little bit. And there have been some terrible musicals. There's a lot of like these jukebox musicals, the ones where they take existing songs and try to shoehorn them into musicals in like Mamma Mia or Rock of Ages or whatever. That's not what this is. This is more in the style of uh, you know, the, um, the Leonard Bernstein, the West Side Story kind of like style of thing where the music suits the story. It's not the other way around, and where it's created to tell a story and not just like shoehorned in there. So yeah. And if you have a 3 hour drive and you just want to listen to the whole thing, it's a great way to spend time with the family listening to it. So yeah, please check it out.
And do you want to share your honorable mention? So these are your some of your favorite albums that on a different, maybe if you came on tomorrow, you'd have 5 different albums. So if you want to just rapid fire through other great albums that our listeners should go check out.
So I didn't think about specific albums because it could be any one of numbers of albums by some of these artists. The Waterboys, Husker Du, REM, Pixies, Replacements, Jeff Buckley, Joni Mitchell, Beck, Big Star, Billy Joel, Bjork, Concrete Blonde, David Bowie, Dinosaur Jr., Fishbone, Faith No More, Hanoi Rocks, Massive Attack, Rush, Pink Floyd, Midnight Oil, Sade, Steely Dan, Stone Temple Pilots, and I only got through as far as S on my iTunes library before I ran out of time. So there's probably more to come as well.
That's all good. That's a pretty incredible list. Man, thank you so much for coming back on for the My Five Favorite Albums series. I had a lot of fun diving into these five albums, learning about the music, learning about the artists. I've added them to my playlist so that now
Excellent.
they're
Great.
in my life and I can start listening to them more frequently. So Jeff, thank you so much, man. What a great list of albums.
Thanks, Joel. This has been really fun. I kind of forgot that we were recording this. I thought we were just yakking about music.
Just
So,
two music nerds talking
yeah,
about music.
totally.
That's all good. So, man, thanks again for your time. So, for the listeners that have stuck with us for the last 2 hours, thank you to the Jeff fans, to the Moist fans. Thanks for sticking around, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Okay, thank you.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to subscribe, like, comment, and share. Who would you like me to feature next for a 2-hour deep dive interview? You can let me know in the comments. You can also send me an email at joelmartinmastery@gmail.com, or you can reach out to me on all social media platforms at joelmartinmastery. So I am done. I am complete. I approve this message, and I'll see you on the next episode.